Did I do the right thing? Have I done enough to make up for the mess, the pain I inflicted, the mistakes I can't take back? Can I get back what I lost? The relationship I killed, the health I let go, the days that I wasted? Have I done enough? And what happens when you're sure you have, but it doesn't work out like you think it should? How did you react? How would you react? Anger, rage, sadness, disappointment? I'm not sure if you've ever really thought about it, but if you haven't, let me clue you in. Anger, rage, disappointment, depression, despair. When things don't turn out like you think they should, it all comes from one thing: unmet expectations. What's going on, guys? Welcome to An Invite to Peace. I am your host, Chad Campese. Doesn't it feel great knowing what's going to happen? This, that, it will fix. It will make everything better. This will change everything. But how often are we really ever in charge? How often do things really ever go as planned or work out like we thought they would? And what happens when we are finally brought to our knees as we realize that if we ever really want to fix everything, anything, if this life is ever going to be truly fulfilling, and I mean truly, deeply, like drowning in an ocean of meaning and purpose fulfilling, we have to give up on our expectations. Paul found that out the hard way, as his wife told him he better figure out some things, and fast, as he dealt with depression after his partner was killed in the line of duty. And even now, as he still wonders to this day, even though he knows it's pointless, have I done enough? Have I done enough for God to finally accept me? Have I made up for the past? Am I meeting God's expectations? Look, he knows that question is absurd, and yet, like many of us, without even really knowing it or admitting it, he knows his past, he knows his thoughts, and he knows his own mind. And still, like us, he asks it, have I done enough? My conversation with Paul Milone. All right, I am here with Paul Milone, right? Milone, am I pronouncing that right?
Correct.
Gotcha. How are you tonight, sir?
I'm doing good. And yourself, Chad?
I am good, man. I am good. I appreciate you coming on. The biggest question that we got tonight to go over is, if you could think back, or it could be fresh in your mind, I don't know, what is the biggest question, most important question you've had either of God, to God, or just about life in general?
Yeah, that's a loaded question that I deal with on a regular basis. And by explaining why I'm saying that, I feel that some viewers who are they're gonna think, well, you don't understand your faith. Then my biggest question is, have I done enough? And that's embarrassing to ask because I know there's nothing that I can do to gain salvation. There's nothing that Paul Milone can do to earn God's grace. I completely understand that. I'm down with it. But I also know that, James tells us, faith without works is dead. And what is works? Works is doing things for other people. I worked in the gang unit, and we were doing stuff that cops understand, but most people don't understand. And then I got on the SWAT team, and we're doing even crazier stuff. And then I started working undercover in narcotics, buying drugs and guns. And our department, our SWAT team, is a part-time team, but it's extremely busy. So I got to the point to where I was working 18-hour days because I had my narcotic stuff in the middle of the day. I had SWAT in the morning and sometimes SWAT at night. There was times where I would literally sleep in my Suburban in the parking lot of the precinct or the SWAT office because I had like 2 hours to go before I had to start again. And I was running so hard, so long, Chad, that I'm lucky that I didn't have some major tragedy and for me, that led me to that. I did have a partner that was shot and killed in that process. My wife had a medical emergency that almost killed her, and those two events were kind of back to back. And this was when I was still just kind of going to church and just kind of standing up, sitting down, kneeling when everybody else did. I still didn't understand it. but I wanted to go. I just didn't have enough guts to start asking people questions. I just was going.
What did faith, church, God, what did all that look like starting out for you? We can start in kind of a childhood time with parents taking you to church. Were you
Sure.
part of a religious background? What did that look like
It's
just to
not going
kind
to
of...
take long to explain my religious background.
Oh,
I
okay.
was baptized as an infant.
Gotcha.
That's it.
That's it.
We didn't go to church unless it was a funeral or a wedding. The only real um, religion in our household is if my grandparents came over for dinner on a Sunday, which they did quite often, and my grandfather would lead us in a prayer before the meal. That literally was it. I was given the choice in grade school to go to CCD or go play soccer, and I chose soccer. My parents were children of the 60s, and they weren't hippies by any means, but they both went to Catholic grade schools and high schools, and without choice, and they were going to let me and my brother and sister decide what we wanted to do. Um, and you don't want to ever go back, and you got to tear down the rearview mirror of life. But, there's times I wish I had a religious education upbringing, but if I did, maybe I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you today. So, but I had nothing. And when I finally started having some inklings that there's more to this world than me, uh, you know, the amazingness of God's creation. It really started when I'd be out deer hunting in a tree stand, and I would be there for 4 or 5 hours in perfect solitude. And I'm thinking, this world's kind of cool. And then when my daughter was born, it's interesting. I made the conscious decision. I said, I'm not going to raise her in the way that I was raised. Even though I didn't know anything about it, I was going to start going to church every week and making sure that she goes. And even if I didn't have the answers originally, somebody in the church had the answers, and she at least would be exposed to having, a faith-based, childhood. And thankfully, she is still really strong in her faith. So it kind of worked out. But what was great about it is it taught me along the way that, okay, now I'm starting to hear scripture every Sunday, and I can start looking those things up, and what does it mean after the homily talks about here's maybe how this applies to your life. So it really took me on a journey. And then like I was just talking about, man, I started charging so hard, and as a narcotics guy undercover, you got to be in control. And as a SWAT guy, you got to be in control. As a cop, you got to be in control. But man, I let that seep into every aspect of my life. And if I didn't get a green light at the right time, I was furious. And if my daughter's big wheel was parked behind it, whatever it was, I got so furious because this guy has to control everything, all needing to be in control of everything, prior to my conversion. That's really right in the zenith of the 18-hour days and sleeping in my car at the precinct, just backing out of the driveway, and a bicycle or big wheel or something was behind the car, and I didn't hit it, but I got out of the car and I slammed my expensive sunglasses to the ground and shattered them. And that's one of the times my wife's like, "Hey, you're out of control. You need to figure this out." And yeah, so I was charging hard for several years on end, burning the candle at both ends, as they say. And there was one day at work in particular, and prior to this, my wife had been telling me I need to figure some things out. But one of my partners at work, Edie, she told me one day, "What the hell's wrong with you? What's going on? I thought you were a nice guy."
What led up to her saying that?
Oh, just me being a complete control freak over this and that. And, when you're writing search warrants and doing interviews and making the buys and making the arrests and serving the search warrants, and, my days just never ended. It was monster. It was coffee in the morning, monster in the afternoon and evening, and then maybe some beers at night to try to fall asleep for 3 hours and go back and do it again and again and again. On the SWAT team, man, I was breaking down 15 doors a month. It was out of control. We were so busy. It's like I said, I really kind of built up to this peak of out of controlness. And my wife was hitting me up with what's wrong with you. And when my partner is looking at me, telling me, what the hell's wrong with you, I started thinking, okay, there is probably an issue. But regardless, I was driving home one night, and it was an amazing event. At the time, my undercover vehicle was this small 2-door Chevy Blazer, and two guys my size our shoulders were almost touching us. How tight this Blazer was. There was a back seat, but you couldn't hardly even get into it because it was a 2-door Blazer. Driving home, and it used to be to where on the drive home, I'm still cranking up Metallica or something loud and kind of keeping the energy going. And I live about 35 to 40 minutes from where my narcotics office was. So on this night, I had such a rough day that nothing went my way. I couldn't get the simplest things to go Paul's way. And I was so unbelievably frustrated. And I don't recall if that's the same day that Edie made that comment or not, but it was very close proximity to it. But I was driving by the casinos, just on my route home. I don't gamble. Driving by the casinos, I didn't have any music on. All I'm listening to is the hum of the tires on the road. I was probably rubbing my head like, what is wrong with me? I couldn't do anything right today. Everything I did was a failure. And there was an audible voice. And I said, it's okay, Paul, let go. I'm in control.
Like a legitimate audible voice in your car.
Scared the hell out of me. I literally turned around, looked in the back of my seat, thinking one of my buddies was in the car messing with me, because they knew I was struggling or something. Of course, there was nobody there.
And I guess if I could just point this out real quick, and I want to make sure this is accurate. This is how it was for me, and I think is the way he explained it was for you. In that car, driving home that night, when you heard the audible voice that changed your world, you weren't seeking that out at that point, right?
No.
You weren't in prayer. You weren't like, God, talk to me, give me a sign, nothing. You were just driving home.
Just driving home. And what I tell people is that I think he just had, I don't want to speak for him. It's like he couldn't wait on me anymore, because I think there were so many nudges and I didn't take that step. He's like, all right, I'm done waiting on you. I need you. And I need you for down the road to help other people. I need you for you. I need you to hear me, because you're not hearing the subtle. It clearly states that he will call you by name. And in my heart of hearts, I truly believe that's what happened that night. He wanted to claim me, and he did. And I couldn't hold off anymore.
What does that tell you about God's timing and his call on people's lives?
Well, his timing is perfect. I think, if I would have gone to a retreat, whatever, 2 years prior, I might have been like, that was all right. Or if I would have waited 6 months longer, maybe I'd be dead. I don't know. I have just learned to trust that his timing is perfect. And again, that's why I don't hesitate to forward something that I read and somebody's face and name comes into my head. I'm like, maybe that's God telling me to do that. Maybe it's not. But again, I think the results of those timings have shown that the timing was right, because I don't get a negative response. I get a positive response. So I've just learned to trust that, hey, if I get something in my head about somebody, some event that needs attention or needs a hug or whatever it may be, is that, okay, I'm going to do it. And because again, I think that's the route he took with me, is that this is the time.
I mean, I think it clearly, maybe you could push back on it a little bit. I don't think you will, but I think that also clearly shows a purpose. There's a purpose for you. There's a meaning for your life. There's a plan that he's got in place. And if Paul or Chad or whoever's listening right now isn't going to take the subtle nudges, he's going to take a bolder approach, as he did, obviously.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. I tell people that all the time. If you're not hearing the whisper, at some point he's going to probably smack you across the face. And hopefully it doesn't take a tragedy for that to happen. A tragedy with you personally that you kill someone in a DUI or whatever it may be. It doesn't, it doesn't have to be some event where you're arrested or you get divorced or whatever. Is that hopefully you can hear that still small voice. Okay, I know what that is. Probably 9 months to a year prior to that, continuously, a guy at church kept inviting me to go to this retreat, and I kept telling him I was too busy. And I was extremely busy, as I just explained, but I could have easily taken a couple of days of vacation and not gone to work, not answered the SWAT pager, and gone to a retreat. But I didn't do it because I was embarrassed that I knew almost nothing, and I figured I would be exposed as a fraud at this retreat. Hey, what's your favorite passage? I don't know. I don't know a passage. Um, and so after that audible voice, it scared me because I knew whose voice it was, and I knew that God knew me, and I didn't know Him. And so I made the decision right there. So I'm going to the next retreat, and that was probably
As you're driving this car,
as I was driving.
you hear this audible voice. Immediately, you think, "I'm going to this next retreat."
I figured because I'm in deep.
Yeah.
If God is going to call out to someone who doesn't follow Him, ardently, I figured I was in real trouble. And so I called Vinny. I'm like, hey, man, the next morning, I'm like, I'm not sure when the next retreat is, but I have to go, like in those words.
Yeah.
And luckily for me, it was like 2 months later.
Did you tell him what led you to that phone call?
I don't recall that I did. There was still some embarrassment.
I was going to say, man, take me back to this car. Like, what are you thinking? What are you feeling when you hear this? Are you?
I was scared.
Yeah.
I was scared. I was ashamed. He tells us that I call you by name. I didn't know that then. I didn't know that passage. But I was literally scared, that either something big is going to happen or my life is in doom or something, because why would God reach out to me? I'm nobody. I've done nothing for Him. I've spent no time worshiping Him. Yeah, I was going to church on Sundays, following the crowd, but I was doing that intentionally so my daughter wouldn't grow up without knowing anything. It was self-serving, right? And so it made me to try to make me feel better that I'm a better parent than my parents were, and I don't mean that my parents were great people, but they just didn't have a strong faith then. And so, yeah, when I called Vince, I'm like, hey, I got to go. Luckily, it was a couple months later. And at the retreat, there was a lot of things that I expected would happen. They're asked, in a nice way, hey, what's your favorite passage? And I'm like, I've heard of John 3:16, from people holding cardboard signs up at a football game, but I didn't know what it meant. And I broke down pretty hard at that retreat. I cried and in my heart gave my life to Christ. And it was a Catholic retreat, and part of the retreat is reconciliation with the priest. And I was nervous because I had never gone to confession in my life. I didn't know how to do a confession. I had no clue. And so it's my turn. I'm like waiting to be the last guy to go. And I finally go in there and I told Father Don, I'm like, literally, I told us, I said, you should throw me out right now. And he's like,
you told the priest he should throw you out of the retreat.
he's like, why would I do that? I said, because I'm a complete fraud. I said, I explained to him all the stuff that I just was telling you, is that I don't know anything. And these other guys here are awesome, and I'm not. And he sat back and he smiled and he pat me on my knee. He's like, we'll get you there, Paul. And that in and of itself was huge, realizing that the church would still accept me.
Well, let's head back just a little bit. I guess between college, not having faith, and then you have your daughter, so you start going to church. When we talk about the first big tragedy, then the partner death, is that probably what was top of the line? Or okay,
yes, when Jason got killed, yeah, I was so unprepared for that. They tell you that in the academy, right? But that's not going to happen to in my time frame,
Yeah.
completely unprepared, non-faith based, unprepared, but wholly unprepared, faith based.
Can you take us to the kind of the circumstances as to what happened and then kind of where that led you as far as faith and questioning and that kind of thing?
Yeah, it was interesting. So, um, my partner Jason at the time, he he had just got kicked out of a vice job. He went on a radio program and did an unauthorized interview and was talking about prostitution stings and stuff. So he got the boot from what we call the offsite, which was great for me because he came back to the Northeast precinct and he's like, "Hey, you want to ride?" I'm like, "Absolutely, I want to be your partner." Um, and it's another embarrassing point. He was one of the coolest guys on the department. Command officers would tell you that. Street cops would tell you that. He was the cool guy, and cool in a sense of just a very nice human being, and funny and boisterous, and um, but riding around, as you ride with someone in your car for 8 hours a day for months on end, you learn a lot about them. And I remember Jason told me that he and his wife prayed every night, and I found that odd. I'm like, you pray? Well, I found it odd, but I was also embarrassed because I didn't even have enough guts to tell my partner or to ask my partner questions. I was so embarrassed that I knew nothing, that I couldn't even you know reach out to Jason and say, "Hey, tell me more." And I'm so embarrassed about that. Um,
About faith specifically, I'm
yeah,
assuming, or okay.
yeah, but hey, tell me about God, because
Yeah.
hey, I don't know anything. But I would say, "Oh yeah, I'm Catholic," because that's I was baptized, and that was it. I was
Yeah.
baptized, um, and so when he was killed, it was devastating. It was three months ish of severe depression. I literally had another job lined up. I was going to quit the police department. Um, I
Were
didn't
you
let my
there in the situation that
I was
as his
not. So
partner or oh, okay.
so we were partners for 9 months, which isn't that long, but we did everything together, inside the job, outside the job. And I got a phone call one day to see if I wanted to go to the gang unit, which is a fairly coveted position at the police department where I'm at. And it's out at that offsite where he just got kicked out of, 9 months before. And this is how dumb I am. I didn't even call my wife. I called Jason. I'm like, "Hey, what should I do?" He's like, "You'd be stupid not to take the gang job." And so I took the gang job. And man, I'm telling you, Chad, you couldn't be busier. We were hitting 3, 4 search warrants a day. Um, and so they're just so uber busy that, Jason and I were working out every day together. We were going hunting and fishing together. But when I got the gang unit job, man, I was 120% into the gang unit job. And I was walking into the precinct one day, um, and he was walking out. I had left him at that point, and he hit me on the shoulder. I was like, "Hey, bud, don't be a stranger." And I'm like, "Oh yeah, all right, man. I'll get a hold of you. I've just been busy." And those words were in my head when he got killed. And it wasn't too long after that he was shot and killed. And I wasn't with him. So you have that guilt of, if I was there, it would have been different. Nothing would have changed what happened that night. Um, but that hit pretty hard, and it lasted for a long time. Um, but I've been able to turn that into joy. I got to sit next to the guy for 9 months, and we were very close. Um, so I've turned that into joy, and I'm still very close with his wife, um, and her children, and uh, I've I've done everything I can to keep his memory alive. I host a memorial shooting competition every year in his name, and um, never forget the anniversary, and doing things with his kids on their birthdays and stuff like that. He was a big part of me, and but again, I don't know that I'd be sitting here talking to you today if that hadn't happened.
Were
I don't know if
there
I don't know if I'd have my faith if that hadn't happened.
Well, that was what I was going to ask. Was after he got shot and killed, and you had mentioned maybe 3 to 4 months of a depression or something like that that ensued for you. During that time, were there questions of God, questions of life, questions of purpose and meaning that came with him getting killed that kind of affected you, or what did that look like as you're trying to kind of piece that together?
So I didn't have any questions that, hey, well, God isn't real and why would God do this? That never crept in my mind. But it was probably right about that 2 or 3 month mark. My wife and I were at my nephew's first communion, and I leaned into her and I told her, I said, I want to get closer to God. I literally told her that. I had no idea how, nor did I have enough guts to start asking people. It was still that embarrassing moment of he was starting to pull on me, but I was keeping him back of I want to, but I don't really want to because I don't want to change. I don't want to change my life. I don't know what was in
Right.
my mind, but I leaned in and I told her, said I want to get closer to God,
And that
and
was because of Jason's death, you think?
yeah, I believe so.
Okay.
That in combination of hey, I got a daughter in this game now. There's more to life than me. Um, but I think his death was a big part of it. And when you don't have Jesus and tragedy strikes, it's really hard. My other partner that was killed, I'd already had faith, and I had spent a lot of time talking with Greg about our faith life, and knowing that each of us knew each other where their salvation lied. And when Greg died, I was at so much more peace because this life is temporary, right? And um, save a place for me, is kind of the thought. And it was a true dichotomy of those first couple tragedies, and then the tragedy of Greg dying, and then me getting involved in that shooting. Um, both of those, which should be very difficult on people, I was actually at peace with those. The latter two, whereas the first two, I was a complete mess. I had somewhere to turn later on, right? I turned to Christ. And the first two, I didn't. You try to turn to people, maybe, and that's not as beneficial,
Right.
not as healing. At least how it works for me, anyways.
Gotcha. So tell me, from Jason's death to telling your wife, I want to know more about God, what's your wife's response to this? What is she seeing you? How does she respond to you? Does she want to help? Does she thinking, hey, what's going on with you? Where does that kind of lead?
No, it was kind of. I wouldn't say it's in one ear out the other. She was probably just as lost as me. She couldn't have really been the one to say, okay, let me explain stuff to you. She wasn't going to have that knowledge base. Um, you know, like I played football in college on a scholarship, and I would always tell people that I'm lucky. That the way I met my wife was 100% God put us together. I didn't know it at the time. I told people I was lucky how I met her. We didn't have any mutual friends. We ended up being in a class together, and we were supposed to be sitting on opposite ends of the room in like a huge 200-person auditorium, and the seating chart got mixed up, and so she sat next to me. So I would have no way of meeting her. We had no same social circles, but I always told people that I was lucky. When I got in the gang unit, I told people I was lucky. When I got in the SWAT team, I told people I was lucky. I gave no glory to God over any of those things because I just didn't know yet. And then realizing, oh no, it's not luck. It's I'm blessed in those things. Yeah, so there was still that 5 year gap of chipping on that next thing of, hey, I'm lucky and I'm kicking butt. I'm winning awards, or I'm getting these great cases, or doing cool things. But mostly it was still, that's because Paul Maloney's good, not because God is good.
Right.
Um,
What
and
was
then
the cost a little bit, if you could go into that? So, I mean, I'm just thinking out loud, having a family of my own and being an officer and knowing how much officers work depending on what their status is. But obviously, you're day in, day out doing this, doing that. You've got a 2-year-old, a wife. What's the cost of that, of being at work all the time and letting them be at home? What did that look like?
the only thing that I think the only area where I probably didn't screw up a whole lot was with my daughter. I cherished every second I could have with her, and um, but yeah, there was cost with the relationship with my wife. It would there were some struggles, but luckily for me, she had done the same job. Minus SWAT, she had done undercover and done homicide, and she
Oh,
was
so
she
she
was
she
busy too.
understood.
Yeah,
Yeah.
um, and luckily she was gracious at times. There's times where she was not so gracious, trying to tell me to slow down. you know, it cost me some friendly relationships, some permanent, but mostly just temporary, pushing me away for a while. And just because I was so full of me doing what I'm doing. Um, at the same time, I went through a couple year phase where being brash I thought was cool, right? The more brash I am, the funnier I am. And it's sad. I have a female cousin or husband that I used to be really close with, and they don't talk to me. And it's my fault. So that they were close friends. That cost a relationship. Um, I hold out hope that we can
One
reconcile at
day.
some point. One
Yeah.
day. Yeah.
So take me back to the medical issue with your wife and Faith. You don't need to go into the details of what she was going through, obviously, if you don't want to, but what did that look like? You said you never really had any questions of, is God real, or why is God doing this to me, or anything like that. Are there any other questions of faith that brought up in those situations, of God or for God, or anything like that ate at you?
It didn't. I didn't think about where is God and all this, because I didn't think about God. She had an 8-inch long blood clot in her pelvis that they found accidentally,
Oh my.
um, and they ran in and got the emergency vascular surgeon, and he came in. He's like, "Hey, this is a problem. We're gonna have to try to get it out, but the chances are we're not going to get it out, and she's going to die. Get your family in town, get her family in town, make sure you got a will in place." And we got like 15 minutes. You know, Man, you want to talk about a kick in the gut
Wow.
of completely lost, not knowing who to call or what to do. And that's the thing. Without knowing Jesus, you are lost in those things, and you you must reach to something else. And for me, it was just my mind just spun. You know, whatever 4 or 6 hours later, whenever he came in from the surgery, and um, he gave me the all the way down the hall. I felt like I was in a movie, walking down a hallway. The nurse came and got me from the cafeteria and put me in this tiny little 2-person waiting room, and I'm watching him come down the hallway, and he has just a blank stare on his face. I mean, zero
Oh
emotion
man.
whatsoever. He sits down. I'm thinking she dead. She didn't make it. He patted me on the leg. He's like, "Yep, we got it. No big deal." I'm like,
Oh jeez.
"Yeah." And I didn't even have enough heart or knowledge to say thanks to God. It
Yeah.
just was like, "Whew, got lucky again." And
So
looking back, I'm just embarrassed by you know the person that I was then. Not giving credence to him. Um, and that was after I leaned in and told her I want to get closer to God. Not much long after, but probably within a month, I guess, somewhere in that time frame. So I had verbalized it, but I had not internalized anything.
yeah. So it's interesting to me what it brings up, I guess, is I don't know if it's a question or just a statement, but you don't you don't question God, you don't question if he's real, you don't really have any questions about why he would let these kind of things happen to your family or friends. At the same time, you want to get to know him more, but you don't really know what he or it is. So is there just like I guess as you're exploring that more, are you just kind of leaning on what you knew about, at least from your childhood from the Catholic Church? Or was there something else you saw that made you think about God or what he could be that made you want to know him more besides, is it just Jason, what Jason told you and being
No,
partners,
so
or?
yeah, so I will give credit to, well, there's probably a lot of people that need credit. Vinny, the guy who invited me to the retreat, his wife was actually my childhood babysitter. Just small world stuff. And
Oh man.
but there's two guys that work, Dan Clark and Jim Slauson. Jim was an ATF agent, retired. Dan Clark and he was a guy that I held up in esteem up here, as a SWAT guy and a NARC guy, and just an overall I mean, like legendary kind of police officer. And Jim, the ATF agent, would brief him for dope deals. A lot of times you might stand around for 45 minutes or an hour and wait for something to happen. So you're sitting there BSing. And I think both those guys could see that internally I wasn't doing awesome. Externally I was pounding the chest, hey, this is all awesome, and we're kicking butt on this job. And Jim would talk to me about, faith and ask where I was. And I
Wow.
was embarrassed to get in that conversation, but I would listen. And then one day, Dan Clark, he handed me a mixed CD that he had made with all Christian music. And I'm like, well, if Dan Clark's given this to me, I'm going to check it out. And there was songs by Third Day, um, and I just like, okay, this is pretty cool. I don't have to listen to Metallica all the time. I can listen to something else. And that all those were kind of right at the prefaces of that ride home. It all started happening, bing, bing, bing of getting the music and Jim talking to me some more and just listening to Jim talk. Jim would witness to every guy we arrested, every guy and gal. Before they went to jail or before they got released to be an informant, he would witness to them and ask them where they are, and he did it genuinely. It wasn't just checking a box or something. He really wanted to know where they were with their relationship with Christ, and the cool thing about him, he was so gentle about it and so kind as opposed to in your face. Um, and so I still communicate with him on a regular basis and give him a bunch of credit for that gentle nudge of, hey, bud, there's more to you in this world. So those two are a big part for me.
So it sounds like, and again, I've been an officer for going on 23 years now, and there is at different departments I've been around, there is a certain, I don't want to say stigma, but there's a certain identity that a lot of us have to hold or feel like we have to hold on calls and in the uniform and in certain, gang units and SWAT and whatever, I feel like. But it sounds like Jim and your other friend, was it Dave, you said? Dan, I'm sorry, Jim and Dan, kind of showed you a softer side or a different side and had a different kind of aura about them than all the other guys that you knew, and it kind of made them stand out as they kind of, I don't know, ministered to you in a way.
Yeah, it's funny because you say softer and Dan, and those two don't generally ever meet. He's a world-class martial artist and just an unbelievable human being.
Gentle soul
Yeah,
inside. Yeah.
but Dan, being this guy up here, not just for me, but for so many on the department. I mean, he's a legend, right? Led me to do this. Led me to, once I finally accepted Christ in my life, I realized it's not a spectator sport. You need to participate. And so I finally had enough courage, and I asked the guys on the SWAT team if they would pray with me before every search warrant. And at first it was one guy or two guys, and then it was 4 or 5 guys. And for probably the last 8 or 10 years that I was on the team, it was everybody. And if I wasn't there, somebody else led the prayer. And that got infectious to other people on the department. That picture was taken of us without us knowing, by a sergeant in one of the precincts who saw us doing it before a search warrant. And he gave us the pictures like, you guys don't realize it. The other guys are seeing you do this, the other guys and gals, and they're watching you. And that was completely unintentional. We didn't go up on stage and do it. We didn't do it intentionally. We'd go out and do it out of the back of the van. And, it changed the atmosphere in the van. It used to be riding toward a search warrant for a homicide suspect or a gang member. We know there's a shooter. The van was very raunchy because guys were trying to let off steam. Guys were trying to realize, hey, we're going to go knock the door of a murderer. And we're going to go in fast. After we started praying, it was so much more of a calm, relaxed van ride. It was pretty cool to see the dichotomy of pre and post. Doing a prayer as a group of men, Christian men, going to do Lord's work, as we would say. It was a cool change.
I'm not going to let you off that easy. So I need to know. You said one day you decided to ask. What led up to this day, and what are the thoughts in your head and maybe the butterflies in your heart as you're about to ask people to start praying over this first search warrant?
Okay, so that is an awesome question. It's only been asked a couple times, and I will give credit. So again, I'm this new guy in faith, right? I'm still not very learned. The desire was there, and I had a very close friend who is still a close friend, Scotty, and Scotty is very, very personal with his faith. But he made a comment one day. He says, "Man, I wish we would say prayers on the team," and that was it. He said, "I wish we would say prayers," because he never really got into the vulgarity and the other stuff that was again, it literally was just letting off steam, and it already had been in my mind that I wanted to do this. I was just trying to garner up enough courage to do it, and I'm like, "That's it." I said, "Next time I'm doing it." Um, and I
Because of
asked
Scotty.
because of Scotty, and I
Yeah.
asked one other guy, Zach. I'm like, "Hey, Zach, what do you think?" And Zach I knew Zach was a strong Christian, just because of knowing him, but it's not like we'd ever prayed together or anything. Like, okay, I'm gonna ask Zach, and Zach said, "Paul, you got a lot of cojones to do this." Yeah, he didn't use the word cojones, but
Hey, this is a no filter
and I said,
podcast, Paul. You can say whatever
said
you want.
he said, "You got a lot of balls to do that." I'm like, "I'm doing it," and between Scotty saying, "I wish we would do this," and Zach saying that's going to take some guts, like, you know what, that must mean something. And so I'd asked the guys before a search warrant, and they're all like, "What?" Well, Zach jumped out of the van and one other guy, and it was probably not the holiest prayer ever given pre-battle. Um, Stumbled through it, but I got done. I'm like, "Oh my god, that was so good. That was so fulfilling for me." And it's just three of us, arm in arm, right? And then the next time it was like 4 or 5 guys, and then, like I said, it snowballed, and it even got to the point where if we got to an emergency situation to where we didn't have the time to spare because we got to go now, we do it in the van on en route. Um, and it was cool to see these other guys take ownership of it. Um, because I don't get to go on every search warrant. That was part of my problem back in the early days, is I tried to go on every single search warrant. That's why I was so busy. Um, but after my conversion, it's like, okay, I can slow down a little bit. I don't have to go on every one of them. Um, and especially now that other guys were taking the lead on doing their prayers. So, I maybe not jokingly, but I do say that I think that's one of my greatest accomplishments on the job. No big narc case, no big other case. Getting those guys to do that as a team was probably the thing I'm most proud of.
I'm
Hell,
curious how
I saved a life on a hostage rescue, but I'm more proud of getting these guys to pray. Um,
over
yeah,
you're more proud of the example you had for God than anything that you accomplished on the job,
yeah,
award wise at least.
yeah.
Gotcha. Who was the one that took over?
Oh, there's several guys. Zach took over for a while, then a guy named Brendan O'Flynn, and there's some younger guys they were like all in. They were the first search warrant they were on. They were in, and real strong guys. Nate Burrish. I think I sent you a link to him.
Oh
Maybe
yeah,
intro to
yeah,
Nate.
yeah.
Yep,
I've heard Nate is a very quiet guy too. So according to Jake, that's what Jake said.
he is a quiet guy.
Yeah.
But I think if you talk to him, I think you'll like to hear what he has to say. Very strong Christian.
Do we think God is speaking through other people, even if he's not speaking audibly to us? How many times do you think he spoke to you through others?
I don't know of a number, but absolutely. I mean, Jim Slauson and Dan Clark. Those timings of those things were God's timing, right? Um, yeah, 100%. He uses people, and that's something that I've tried to internalize. With my partner Edie specifically. Again, pat myself on the back. Um, I spent time with her talking about God after the fact and trying to help her strengthen her faith, and whether that is in direct conversation or giving her music or sending passages or a a sermon on a certain passage, things like that. I know that God uses people to help other people, and I know that He has used me. And so, anytime now that I get an inkling, if I listen to a certain song that it all of a sudden just pops in my head, man, Chad might need that right now. I've completely gone away from having any fear. I just send it. That's it. And I tell you, if I've sent 200 songs to people over the last, 10 years, maybe more, I bet you 10 of them, maybe, I didn't get a reply. The rest of them, like, oh my God, thank you. I needed that. And whether it's a song or, again, whether it's a piece of scripture or whether it's now with Facebook, and the scrolls that come across, and you click on those faith-based scrolls, and then you just get more and more of them. And I've hyperlinked so many of those to people, whether it's one of the kids in the faith formation class, or we have a kid right now whose dad died just over a year ago. A police officer died of a heart attack on the job. He's in my class this year, and I've made it my mission to spend as much time helping him as the rest of them combined. But I've been communicating with his widow on a regular basis about, we don't know why things happen. In the end, we'll know, but we just have to trust at this point. And I have yet to have one come back negative saying, "Hey, don't send me this kind of stuff." And very, very small percentage where I don't get a reply saying, "Man, thank you for that. I needed that." And I've just, since that started to happen, it's like, what? I'm not going to change doing that. If somehow that is beneficial, if that is the version of Dan Clark handing me that CD, or Jim Slauson talking to me, if somehow Paul Milone can be the Dan Clark or Jim Slauson to somebody else, that's what we're here for, right? I think one of the questions we'll get asked at the pearly gates is, who'd you bring with you? And that's, to me, it's one thing to be a disciple where you're following. It's another thing to be an apostle where you're inviting, right? So I think that's my current mission, is to try to, bring that good news. And, again, that sounds like a whole lot of backslapping. I'm not awesome at it. I just try to do it. And there's times where I fail to do it, it isn't just in what we do wrong. It's sometimes when we fail to do right. There's times where I miss opportunities, to witness to someone. Hopefully I don't miss very many of them, but,
Have you had the opportunity? So, just with your background and the things you've done in your career, you've been through a lot. Obviously, you're very thankful for those officers that were around you on the job that were able to give you those examples. Clearly, you did the prayer for the SWAT team and kind of started that whole thing. But have you had any opportunities specifically when it comes to people who may have been going through something similar to what you've gone through, the loss of a partner, and you've been able to walk them through, or God's given you the opportunity to walk them through that situation with kind of a faithful background and just being there for them and kind of guiding them in that situation?
Absolutely. Prior to being a police officer, I worked with troubled youth. I was basically a counselor of sorts. I didn't get a master's degree in human services, which is basically, social work, right? So I have a background in some of that training, and I can't tell you the number of times where I've turned into a counselor for other cops, whether it's a divorce or whether it's, again, loss of life, whether it's another cop or whether it's family members or, whatever it is. I jokingly refer to myself sometimes as Paul the counselor,
Oh,
with other
nice.
cops. And I'm not saying it's always awesome, and I'm not saying it's that Jim Slauson super in-depth scripture stuff. But it always is faith-based, and it always is, just from the heart of, hey, here for you, you can get through it, and I try to find scripture that might go with that. Again, or music that goes with that speaks to that kind of situation. But yeah, no, it's been a lot. And there's a funny story that goes with it. So when I retired from full-time work, I had invited that guy I talked about, Dan Clark, the guy that said was a legend.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a blessed man. I had hundreds of people show up for my retirement party, and I was just amazed at everybody that showed up. And I kept wanting. Years prior, I had kept trying to get Dan to go to lunch, so I wanted to tell him thank you for being a part of my transformation. And whether it's just the music or whether it's how he carried himself, I wanted to have just a one-on-one conversation with Dan. And Dan is an extraordinarily business guy. He owns a massively successful security company now. And we never could hook up. And he showed up to my retirement party. And I finally dragged him away from the crowd and I went out back of this bar, restaurant, lounge that we had the party room in. And I'm starting to tell him, hey, I want to thank you. You personally bear some responsibility for the current state of Paul. And we're literally, Chad, we're in the middle of this conversation because again, this is a bar restaurant combo. It's I live out in the country, so there's not a lot around, but it's a popular place. And this 20-something, 25-ish-year-old kid comes walking by. He's like, "Hey, Mr. Milone." I look over and I didn't recognize him. I'm like, "Hey, how you doing?" He's like, and he said his name, which I forget, so I'm embarrassed about it. He comes over and interrupts Dan, my conversation with Dan, trying to tell him this. Again, this sounds braggish. I don't mean it that way. But he says, "I want to thank you for the faith formation class. You helped me." And I didn't recognize the kid. We got like 15 kids a year, and it's been like 14 years now. So, I feel bad for not recognizing him. But I'm trying to give Dan thanks for helping me, and he interrupts the conversation, has given me thanks for helping him, and I was just floored. And Dan let us talk for a little bit, and then the young man walks away, and Dan's like, "See how it works?" And I was like, "Wow, that was so cool that happened."
And you probably could have never seen it coming.
Yeah, and if he hadn't bumped into me there, I would have no reason to cross paths with this young man. Just other than that of luck. That's a God thing.
Yeah,
it's a God timing thing right there.
Well, now take me to your wife. Obviously, you said back in 03, 04, 05 were the medical issue and where you guys were at with your faith. What does her journey kind of look like now with you at her side and you kind of obviously wanting to dig into it, being where you're at now? Has that affected her? Is she kind of still searching? What does that look like?
No, she's doing great. At first she just kind of, I wouldn't say just accepted it. I think she was happy for me, and was happy to be along the ride of my journey. And I mean, I jumped in both feet, man. I started teaching classes right away, and Bible studies and these retreats, and it was 100 miles an hour in that direction, as opposed to the search warrant dope buy direction. And then so I went to that initial retreat, and that retreat eventually came to an end at our church. We're a small parish, so we everybody had gone. And so I started looking for other retreats that were similar, and I found one, which is kind of a perpetual event. It happens twice a year, every year, no matter what. Because my retreat was down in small town Glenwood, Iowa. This is Omaha and Fremont, Nebraska based, so there's a million people, and so there's always someone to go. So, anyways, when I started getting involved in that retreat, Christians Encounter Christ, I encouraged my wife to attend the CEC retreat weekend, and she did. And she has since worked a couple weekends as well. So it's helped her quite a bit as well, and church is more serious, and just the general thought of our faith life is way more upfront, than when I first came to trust and believe. So she kind of came along for the ride slowly at first, but it's all good. Yeah, it's a big part of our life together.
Gotcha. and this kind of goes back, the reason I'm asking this is because your first question to me at the onset of the podcast was, have I done enough? And so I wonder if, and this is just me spitballing, thinking out loud, feel free to react as you want. I wonder if all this stuff you're doing for God in the church, do you think it is all kind of God led? Or do you think part of that is also part of Paul Milone trying to do enough? And I don't know the answer to that, but it's something that came to my mind to ask.
I don't believe that in my heart that I'm like, hey, I'm checking boxes like, okay, now I'm closer. I don't think so. And, Paul tells us in Corinthians that faith without any merit is just a resounding gong, right? So to simply utter the words, Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior, without taking it to the next level of I'm doing something about that, doing something with that for other people, in my understanding, is is without merit. It's dead. And when the scribes asked Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? And he said, he answers properly of you're supposed to love your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul. But importantly, love your neighbor as yourself. To love your neighbor as yourself is doing things for them. It's not just saying, hey, you're my neighbor, I love you. No, it's doing things, which goes back to what Paul and James tells us. And I do a ton of stuff. And that's not a bragging thing. I teach faith formation, and I lead retreats for men. I witness at church. I witness outside of church. And I still sometimes have this question in my head, for as amazing as God has been to me, am I doing enough? And again, so I know that's to me, it's the evil one chipping in there trying to tell me that I'm not worthy. But that is the question that rattles around in my brain, like the title of your book, am I a Christian fraud? Am I doing enough, not doing enough? And again, I know that people would tell me, well, then you don't understand it. But that's the thing that rattles around in this noggin.
Are you doing enough? Have you done enough?
There's an old guy that I meet with every Sunday between masses, Leon, and we chat for about half hour every Sunday, and we talk about knowing God, loving God, serving God. How are we in those aspects of our life, and then what is our priorities for the next week? That's part of that CEC program, and we started doing that right away. And again, so I didn't retire from the SWAT team until 2021, and so I was still crazy busy, with the faith side of it and also the work side of it. And there was a couple times, multiple times, where we're meeting, and I would tell them, I said, "This is the last year I'm teaching faith formation. I'm just too busy. I can't do this anymore. I'm burning the candle at both ends." And Leon, the ever wise one, would say, "He's like, which one's more important? There's other guys that can do the SWAT team. He, he always tells me, with my career, with the jobs I had, with the history that I had, and it's high school age kids that I teach who might be more excited about this undercover guy, the SWAT guy who's done these things, than a 70-year-old guy in the church who they can't relate to as much." So he tells me, he's like, "You can't quit doing this." He says, "This is what you need to do. Maybe give up on some of the other stuff." And he's got grandkids in the church, so he's like, "You definitely can't quit until my grandkids get through the class." But again, so that's a sidebar. But I don't believe I do any of it as I'm trying to fulfill that thing. If I've done enough, I think it's more of, he has done so much for me. How can I not do this? How can I not try to spread his word? And if they maybe would listen to me more so than, some old guy or some little old lady, who are beautiful people who do it, and they're probably way more holy than me, but maybe the kids don't connect with them as much. That high school age class. Maybe that is what I'm supposed to do right now, and so it sure feels like it. And also, Chad, it's that every class that I teach, I learn something new. In the lesson plan, the preparation for the lesson plan, I learned something new, or I try to force myself to learn something new about why do we do this? What's the history of this aspect of the church? Where does this come into play? And that's the problem with lots of Christians, and especially lots of Catholics, is don't always necessarily know the history. And well, those answers are findable, and a lot of times they don't know those answers because their parents don't know those answers. It's just, well, we go to church on Sunday. This is what we're supposed to do. Well, why? Why are we doing these things? Why do we worship in this way? Why do we say these prayers? Or, how am I supposed to live my life with faith in there? So again, prepping for those classes, I learned something. So it's like, okay, cool. I've learned more this year. I got another year under my belt of teaching, and hopefully, maybe some of it is just self-serving, that it's helping me to learn more, because you really dig into Christianity, and the spider web connections from the Old Testament, the New Testament. It's fascinating to learn the connections, if this whole thing's a big giant lie, it's an impossibility. It's a big giant lie to tie these things together over the thousands of years, without computers and without, type technology and all these things. You couldn't keep a lie going that long, or just a falsehood going that long, if it was all BS. It's not possible. So I really get into learning some of the weird, quirky connections of, you know, who wrote the book of Ezra, and why, and what's it about, whatever. Maybe that's one I was reading on recently, um, it just
Do you,
interests me. So,
do you ever, I know the story because you told me this story, because we have shared that obviously from my book, because when I had my issues, look, I knew all the apologetical stuff. I knew all the college level courses about biblical history and all that kind of stuff. But even in those times, and it didn't sound like you really had one in the conversation, which I'm kind of surprised at, which is interesting. I never thought, without the background of God, that you wouldn't have the questions of God, because you really didn't know what to question in the first place. So that's really interesting for me to learn tonight. I had a little bit of a different case when I had that background and I had those questions, and that stuff didn't really comfort in the end and in that moment. But what did was kind of the voice, the experience I had with God calling out to me, that I will never forget, and that I kind of attribute back to you in the car, with the voice you heard. Do you ever share that information at all with the classes you teach? Do you ever get those kind of questions and share that specific spiritual experience that you had with people at all,
oh
or
my
is that
God,
not
every
really?
year,
Oh, okay,
I
gotcha.
witness to that every year. At the end of our program, it's like 8 months, per class. Is we have the kids give a little bit of a witness on their faith journey. It doesn't have to be deep or dark, but we're trying to get them to experience, hey, listen, you need to let other people know where you stand. It's going to be important for you when you become an adult. You're going to go out to college and you're going to be attacked for being a Christian, because it's phony, right? They're going to have their faith attacked, and without having at least some experience of defending and describing their faith, it's going to be harder for them. But yeah, so I do it. I do it every year, and uh, again, I generally get emotional when I do it. Um, but again, it's not because of embarrassment. It's not because of all the bad things that happened to me. It's about how amazing is His love and the grace He gives us. Is it we should have that, the fear of the Lord. That the word for our definition of fear in the English language doesn't equate to the Greek word, which means almost like an unmeasurable reverence of God. Um, if we have that reverence, how can we not share it? So yeah, I give that every year to the kids. I've given that at on the retreat weekends. I tell that same story. Um,
What are the reactions? Do you ever get any reactions like, what? Seriously? You heard the voice of God? Like, no way. Like,
I had kids crying it was only like 2 weeks ago. I had
yeah.
some of the kids in class were crying, not at that particular moment, but, um, I haven't had anybody challenge that, and, even going back and talking to it in my mind, without a doubt, it was an audible voice. But with that said, maybe that's how God works. Maybe it made you think it was an audible voice and he would just was, you know, communicating, in your mind. I don't know that. I don't have a recording of it, but I mean, it literally scared the hell out of me. And like I said, I turned around. I thought someone was in the car. It wasn't just a feeling or a thought. It was like I heard this. And like, oh man, I'm in trouble.
Well, I'm with you. I won't push back either. And
Yeah,
strangely that you mentioned that now that you talk about it from the book and from just telling people, like when I had my experience, nobody's ever, maybe in some of their faces, you could tell they're like, well, really? Like, but nobody's ever forcefully pushed back and been like, nah, that's not like, they've always seemed to be pretty open about it. So that's why yours sounds more like, I guess in a church environment and teaching those classes, I can see. Have you ever shared that with anybody on the police department or outside of the church with that story, and then have pushed back at all? I've been like, yeah, that's crazy
I,
talk. I don't
I
know.
have shared it. I haven't had any pushback. Um, but to be completely honest, if I'm sharing that with someone that's not in the church setting or not in a large group setting at a retreat, or I've done some other public speaking at, a thing called Night of Hope. Um, if it's been a one-on-one thing, conversation in the car, um, to be honest, it's probably because I thought they would be receptive to it. As to I wish again. So I'm here supposedly bragging about myself and all this great stuff I do. I wish I could get the level of Jim Slauson, that ATF agent I tell you about. I wish I had his level um, of good news to spread. Um, that's I haven't done enough in that realm, to be brutally honest.
Have you had people share back with you like, oh, since you told me that, maybe I'm not crazy, and this thing that happened to me, I want to share with you because I thought it was maybe nothing, or I tried to write it off, but maybe it was something. Have you ever had anybody share back after you
Yeah, I've
shared with them?
had people share back, not necessarily that they had an audible, encounter, but yeah, people have shared back for sure, and some just, hey, happy for you, whatever it may be, nothing negative I haven't had, but
Yeah,
probably be a pretty hard circumstance for someone to go all negative on me at that point.
yeah.
Um,
Well, I got to talk to this Jim Slauson. I got to talk to him. He's on my list now. You got me
he's an
all excited
amazing
about
human
that.
being.
Gotcha.
He is of all the people on earth, he's the guy for me. He's just an amazing human being, and I he might know, I don't know, but I can't imagine the numbers of people who he has helped with their conversion. He's got to be in the hundreds, if not more, is my guess. Yeah.
Well, speaking of that, so I'll be respectful of your time here, but I do have kind of a question that comes just from the police realm. Any officers or first responders that be listening to this specifically that goes, if you have anybody or if you had anybody in the background dealing with that kind of thing currently, they don't feel like they could reach out. They don't feel like they want to ask the questions. You've been there, you wanted to learn more, but you weren't sure where to start. You weren't sure who to ask. Clearly, you had people in your life that reached out to you, which was awesome. Do you have any recommendations or any kind of just advice for somebody who's kind of stuck in that spot where they don't want to give up that, I am this tough guy bravado and I'm dealing with stuff in the background, but I don't want to let anybody know because that would just call me out as a fraud or a soft guy or a needy or, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say this: if you believe, even if you waver or have doubts, well, if someone tells you they have no doubts about anything, then they're lying. Um, the apostles had doubts, right? So what I would say is that if you believe that God is real, good, because He is real. Um, and if Jesus can cry for his friend Lazarus, well, we can surely be emotional and weak at times as well. We can. It's okay. You know, it's okay to be vulnerable at times. And if there's anybody out there that happens to know me and they want to call and make it private and be vulnerable, have at it, because I've done that a lot, and I was a pretty physically imposing guy as a cop, 240 pounds, fairly muscular, did a lot of dangerous stuff, as most cops do. But to think that I had to hide any of my faith at this point, and you're gonna call me a wimp? Okay, that's fine. If that's how you want to feel, if Paul's going to squirt a tear when he gives a witness, or is trying to console someone who's having problems, and you're going to say that I'm not tough, bring it on. Probably the greatest example, in the Old Testament, in the Jewish faith, King David, you know, his Psalms, he'd weep in his Psalms, right? And this was the greatest general king ever in the Jewish faith, and he got to the point where throwing his hands up, help me. And so if we can't do that, then we're being a fraud, right? To hold on that that BS armor that I'm a tough guy and I don't cry, or I don't get emotional, or I don't feel sad, then that's just a hard shell that it's phony, and at some point it's going to break down, no matter what. At some point it's going to break down, so own up to it, and it's fine.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your time. I think that's all the questions I want to ask. Is there anything that you have rolling around up top that I haven't asked that you'd like to throw out there for anybody, again, that might be listening, officer or otherwise, just kind of in that space that you were in, I was in, or maybe in a completely different space, searching, looking, anything that you'd come to mind?
Yeah, I'm not. I was sitting there rattling my brain trying to think of a great, awesome, cool last question, but
way to close it out.
yeah, no,
That's okay.
But I absolutely appreciate the what you're doing with this podcast, and the goal of it. It's so needed in our profession. You're supposed to be the big tough guy, and you're supposed to do dangerous things, and it's not supposed to affect you, and but it does. We both know dozens and dozens of people that don't deal with it, when they retire earlier, or they leave after 5 years, because of the tragedy and stuff. But if we truly believe, we know what the end result is, right? We know who wins. And if we truly believe and give our lives to Christ, our goal is eternity, and that's not 5 years or 10 years or 1,000 years. That's forever. And so if that's the case, why should we be embarrassed to admit that, or to tell other people, yeah, I believe in God, and I trust in him, and I don't know the answers, but I trust that his plan is right for me. And that's a hard thing for some people it was hard for this guy to let go of the controls.
Yeah.
So I know it's hard for other people as well, but his plan is the right plan. And when we're standing next to him and he starts to explain this is why, it'll all make sense. The tragedies and the failures and stuff will all make sense at some point. So at least that's how I take it.
Well, that was a good way to close it out. You did a good job. And I know over the podcast, this isn't really, we don't really get into police stories specifically. That isn't kind of the point of the podcast. So I didn't really have you expand on a lot of those. But since we met so long ago, you have written a book since then. If you want to throw that out there where people can find you and find that book if they want to get a hold of you.
Yeah, I did. I wrote a book about my career. And in the middle of the book, I talk about my faith journey. And I mentioned the Jim Slossons and the Dan Clarks, and how my life changed. And I don't go into giant detail like we did tonight, but I go into detail. And the book is called Ram One. That was my position on the SWAT team. Generally speaking, I was the primary breacher. So the title is called Ram One. You can find it on Amazon. It's a pretty easy read. It reads fast. It's just like tonight, it was an overly honest look at at my career, the ups and the downs, the successes and the failures, the things that I screwed up, which is a fair amount of things. And I just try to be as openly honest as I could in telling the story of one guy's ride through that career, and again, faith journey in the middle of it.
Okay. And is there, do you want to throw an email or a website or anything out, or no? If not, that's fine. They can get a hold of me.
The ram1productions.com. But again, if you just Google Ram1 on Amazon, that's an easy way to get it.
Gotcha.
If you go on the website, it's just literally going to direct you to an Amazon link anyways. So.
Okay. Oh, no, I meant to get a hold of you specifically.
Oh,
I didn't know
yes.
if there was a way.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what the email is. If you go to Ram1 Productions, and there's a link to me as well.
Gotcha. And I'll put the website and your email in the show notes. So if somebody wants it, they can go down there and get it.
And if anybody want to reach out, again, whether it's to ask questions about the book, or literally if they wanted to talk about the stuff we talked about tonight, if they don't have someone close, they wanted to talk to someone they don't know, so they're not as embarrassed, I'd take a call in a heartbeat.
Cool. All right, Paul. Well, thank you so very much. I appreciate you coming on. We all appreciate you coming on here in podcast land, and we wish you the best moving forward, man.
Appreciate you very much for having me on, Chad. Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good night.
You too.
Well, what do you think? Has he done enough? Has Paul earned God's grace, mercy, even his attention and love? Has he earned forgiveness, reconciliation? You heard him. He already knows the right answer, just like we all do inherently. That's my question to you now. Have you done enough? Do you have some unmet expectations and things, people, life, even God, that maybe you need to just let go of? It sounds hard, sure, look, but I imagine letting go of these things you think should happen will take about 1,000 pounds of weight, of anger, of depression and sadness, everything that stems from those unmet expectations off your shoulders. We all say it, sure, but do we really believe it? With God, anything is possible. Even the rearranging of our hearts and minds to give up, let go, and be free. Oh, we say it, but do we believe it? Yes, my friend. Just like Paul Milone, you have done enough. He has done enough. But look, if you don't think so, hit me up. Let me know. chad.campese@gmail.com. I'm on Facebook, LinkedIn, wherever. You can find me. Show notes, emails in there. Hey, and don't forget, leave us a review, please. Send this to one person you think it might be helpful to. And guys, if you don't think you've done enough, hit me up. Let me know. We can talk about it. But I promise you, God is big enough. God can handle it. And you have. All right, guys, until next time, I will catch you on the other side.